Great. So the aims of the talk are to try to inspire you guys that collecting data and analysing it throughout your whole career isn't just something you should be doing for your CV or for your ARCP or for your portfolio. I'm going to try to help you understand what we mean when we talk about audit, research and service evaluation. And so you've got definitions for those at your fingertips for your starts and your interviews and everything else, to give you a bit of an insight on the processes you need to go to decide what your project is and how you apply for the right approvals to do your work once you've done that. And then depending on how far we get and how much depth people want me to go into, we can talk a little bit about very basic about how the stats you might use if you're doing a retrospective project and what confounding means and how you might think about that when you're doing it, to give you a few tips so that when you start a project, it's the type of project that's going to be suitable for publication, because I know that that's what most trainees would say they really want when they're thinking about doing a project. And then I'll talk to you about some of the things I did when I was a PEDS trainee, which I think have had meaningful outcomes to me, so I can hopefully show you that it is possible at your level with your post lengths to do something really meaningful. And then I want to just end the talk by showing you the pathway to a big trial, because the pathway to a big trial starts with an audit. And so to show you how you start with things that you might think are quite small and insignificant, but actually that's how we progress to meaningful interventional studies. God. Oh, okay. So why is this important? This is the thing that really inspired me to get into this kind of nerdy data stuff when I was a trainee. As a trainee, you probably see tens, maybe hundreds if you're really super quick and you're doing a really busy specialty of patients per year. And if you don't use any data and you don't do any audits and you don't collect it, your learning is just from those tens of patients. That's what you learn, and that's what everybody learns. You just learn from what you did with them and whether they got better or not. If you collect data from your trust or all the patients you see with all of your friends and you all compare that together, then you're learning from hundreds or even thousands of patients every year from their treatments and their outcomes. And the same goes with what you do. If you treat tens of patients every year, it's a useful thing to do, but you're treating 10 patients every year or whatever. If you contribute to meaningful audit research, and which eventually in years to come changes practice, you might help thousands or even millions of children forever and in the future, no matter what you do with your career. And what about for you personally? Why is this worthwhile for you? Well, it can create meaningful change for your patients in your units, because as trainees, you've got a unique insight. You go from trust to trust to trust, and you might see some places where you think do one thing and it works brilliantly, and other places where you think it's not working so well. And as soon as you're a consultant, that insight will go away. You won't see that anymore. So you won't get that opportunity to go and see, well, what do people do differently and what data could I collect to actually prove that X hospital does this better than Y hospital? And so if you see something you think is either inconsistent, could be done better, or you're not sure which the best way to do it is, you could evaluate it and prove what's best and try to make changes. And if you're early in your career, you can start to develop something that you're interested in, your passion, and then start the building blocks for larger projects and eventually even funding applications and large-scale trials in the future. You can get presentations at conferences and publications, and at the end of the day, they're worth loads of points on specialty applications and for your CV. So, you do need to try to do that if you want to do grid or in moving forward to your consultant interviews. And I think probably the key thing that's really important is doing this work means you understand other people's. So when you're reading a journal or you're reading a new guideline or you're reading an evidence-based guideline or a new paper, if you've actually done research or audit yourself, you'll understand the methods that they're using and you'll become more evidence literate and you'll be able to be an evidence-based practitioner. So what could you do? You're a trainee in a single centre, a DGH, for either 6 months or a year in most parts, or you might be in a tertiary centre. You could do an audit. You can do a service evaluation. You could do a retrospective, or if you're super organised and super keen and somewhere for a really long time, a prospective observational study, or you could do a survey. These are the things I'm talking about today. So what if you can either put something in the chat. I don't think I can see the chat, unfortunately, or just feel free to unmute and shout out, or we've got some trainees in the room with us as well. What does research mean? What does that mean?
It's like the empirical sort of search for new knowledge and new answers in a sort of strategic, logical and fair way. It's not a textbook definition, but those are the sort of things you're trying to get out of it.
Cool. So I don't know if people can hear. I don't know if people can hear what's being said in the room. So we're talking about the search for new knowledge in a strategic and logical way. Anyone got anything else to say about research? I can see the chat now. Actually, I've put it on. I'm getting used to this go meet me thing.
There should be something about lack of bias in there. Someone in that definition as well, I suppose.
Okay, so we're going to move on, and I don't actually know how to move on. That's the problem. Oh, so what's audit then?
Audit's like an evaluation of something, a process or something that already is in place and exists, and I guess looking to see how effective or not something is.
Comparing it to some known standards and then evaluating it.
Yeah, so in the room we're talking about an evaluation, we're talking about known standards rather than the generation of new knowledge. And then so what's service evaluation? The chat is remarkably silent. Maybe no one's got anything to say.
Is it the evaluation of an overall process as opposed? It's probably very similar to audit, or at least includes elements of audit, to look at how well you provide a certain service, for example, an outreach service for a PICU.
Okay, so this is from, I'm just going to close the chat for a sec. This is from the NIHR. This is what they say. So the aim of research is to derive generalizable new knowledge. What they mean by that is, so it's the research is generation of knowledge. You don't know what to do, and so you're trying to find out what to do. That's research. And the generalizable part is you're trying to find out what's best for every child with asthma, for example. You're not just trying to work out what's best for children with asthma in West Middlesex University Hospital Trust. If you're doing research, you're trying to find out what's best for all children with a condition. It might be a very small number of children. Mine in PEDS, we have a very niche population, but it's for everyone. It's generalizable, and it's to generate new knowledge. And the difference between that and audit or service evaluation is audit and service evaluation are genuinely, we have the knowledge, but you're trying to find out whether you're doing it properly and whether it's working for your patients and your service. So the difference between audit and service evaluation being that audit, you already have a gold standard, you've got something really set to mark against. Service evaluation, you may not have a gold standard, but it's still a project that's not generalizable to the whole of the UK. You're not trying to find out the best asthma pathway for the whole of the UK. You're trying to find the best asthma pathway for your service, your population. Is your service working? Or even, I think service evaluation doesn't even have to be saying whether something's working or not. I think it can just be describing the service, because it's still useful to know, well, how many asthma patients are there in North West London with X or Y? Because then you know what the size of your population is and how many patients did we see in clinic, and what, you're evaluating and describing what your service does. Every slide, I'm really struggling to go to the next slide. Okay, and that's just, again, this is from the NIHR website, just to show you. Research is designed to conduct and generate new knowledge. Service evaluation is, what's this service doing? What standard does my service achieve? And audit is when you've got a defined gold standard and you want to find out whether your service meets that gold standard. So what about practically, what does this mean? You've got a project, you've got an idea, and you want to think about whether it's research and what it's going to mean depending on what you register it as. Okay, so research generally will involve collecting new data to test or design a hypothesis or an idea you've got. So something like you know, a new CRF, you're going to go round to the patients and collect data that isn't on the obs chart. It's not the normal routine observation, and it's not data you would normally record. Research can involve an intervention, and it can involve randomization, but neither of those two make it research. What makes it research is you're testing a new idea, and it's generalizable to the whole population once you find it. So, like, I think I've just said this already. So if you're doing a project that just involves collating data from the OBS chart, that's just taking data from ICIP or BadgerNet or PickerNet or whatever, but you're going to make a conclusion that you think will change practice on a very wide scale through the whole of the UK, it still might be research. It'll be retrospective observational research, but it still could be research. Service evaluation usually will be collecting routine clinical data, and the only extra thing you can do for service evaluation that will be new data is you can ask service users what they think, and you can ask service providers what they're doing as part of your service evaluation. That wouldn't necessarily be research. If you just ask for patient satisfaction, that can be service evaluation, a bit like your friends and family tracker, something like that. That's service evaluation. An audit, we've already said. Okay. So what do? You've got an idea, you want to collect some data, you've got an idea, you've got a project, and you want to do it. How do you know what registration forms you need to do, how you register it, and how you're going to do it? This is called the HRA toolkit, and I really would recommend that when you're doing a project that you might want to present at a conference or you might want to get as a publication, do this. It's super easy. This is the whole page. You go on the HRA toolkit website, it's just on Google, and you answer the 3 questions they pose to you, basically. Are the participants in your study randomized to different groups? And I'd suggest as trainees doing projects, unlikely. And then, does your study protocol demand changing treatment or services from the normal standards of care? So are you going to give them a different drug as part of your project? Are you going to give them a different NEB than you would normally, or randomize them or give them something different? Again, unlikely. If you're doing that, then this is a huge project and you're going to need to register it. So that's not really what this talks about. Is your study designed to produce generalizable or transferable findings? So that's the only yes/no one that might mean that your project is research, isn't it? If you're going to try to find out something that may give us new knowledge or change practice in the whole of the UK, then you have to click yes for that. And I think it's important to just touch on that, because if you're going to want to publish this in a big journal, and your conclusions that you want to have in the paper that you publish are, my findings suggest an association between giving steroids in asthma and worse outcomes. That's a generalizable finding. So the journal may say to you, well, where's your IRAS? If you're going to try to say that, you're probably not going to be able to say that with your data. So not having it might be fine, but you just need to think about what's your aim? What do you think your paper's going to say when you have your idea? If you think your paper's going to say something about pediatrics or medicine in general, register it as research. So if you get a answer no, your project's not research, that's great. What I would do, say it gives you a PDF, a little certificate saying you've done the toolkit, and I would save that as a PDF on your desktop and submit it with your trust, audit, service evaluation, information governance form when you register your project. And then if you do end up trying to publish in a journal, you've got a little folder with, I've registered this with information governance, I've done a HRA toolkit, here it is. And because in the kind of introduction to any paper you write, you usually put, this project was registered as a service evaluation with information governance, blah, blah, blah. And then I have, I've got the project registration, but here is my HRA toolkit. So that will be in your introduction. And I've just said again, caution about the generalizable part, because people are getting more and more hot on this. If you try to send a project about asthma to a US journal and you've said in it, this data may suggest a large trial looking at whether steroids and asthma are harmful. If you've said that, you've done research and you haven't registered it. So just be careful about what your conclusions are going to be. Okay, so if it does come up with your project being research, if you think it was generalizable, this is what you have to do. Don't give up. If you're determined and you want to stick at it, there's no reason why you can't register properly a research project that's retrospective. So you just go onto this. This is the IRAS system, the Integrated Research Application System. click on enter there, and you register your project. You describe what you're going to do. If you're only collecting completely anonymous routine clinical data that's usually available to you as a trainee in your work, then this is what you're going to do, and it's completely anonymous, and you're not going to publish it on the web or put it on Facebook or anything. It's likely that you won't need rep approval, and you'll get an IRAS letter very quickly. It only takes a month or so. So don't feel that just because you're worried that it's not an audit what you're doing and someone says it's not an audit that you can't do it. You can, you just go on and get IRAS.
Becky, do the arrows in the bottom left work better? There's little arrows in the bottom left of your screen. It might work better for moving slides.
I think I've got it now. Thanks, Libby. Sorry. I'm like one of those grannies that can't work Zoom. It's so embarrassing. Okay, so what could we do? We've got this idea. What are the kind of things that you might be able to do as a trainee doing a retrospective project? You could describe a population or a condition. If you say you're working in allergy, you could describe how many kids that come to a tertiary allergy clinic have peanut allergy compared to grass allergy. How many children have a certain condition within your service or within your population. You could also describe how something has changed over time. To use the same example, are more kids allergic to peanuts now than they were 10 years ago compared to grass or something like that in your tertiary allergy service or in London? You could describe current practice. Paediatricians are giving magnesium sulfate to 80% of children with viral induced wheeze. When paediatricians choose a form of non-invasive ventilation, they are 80% of the time choosing Optiflow, 20% choosing CPAP, something like that. That's really interesting. If you ever wanted to do a randomized controlled trial, this is the kind of stuff that isn't known, and it's completely obviously really vital. You can describe the features of a condition which are associated with poor outcomes. You know, you've noticed, oh my God, each child with this always dies on my PICU. Famously, you know, bone marrow transplant. You could describe children who've had a bone marrow transplant who end up on PICU have this outcome relative to their severity of illness score and their condition. Children with X always do worse. What features of PIMS TS, for example, are associated with worse outcomes in 6 months' time? You know, is it high troponin or is it a high ferritin? You can also try to describe which management choices that people made that when they're there are associated with better or worse outcomes. So you might be thinking, oh, I absolutely swear anyone who gets salbutamol when they're ventilated on my unit does way worse, or anyone who seems to get fluid boluses gets this or something else, and you're absolutely sure of it and you really want to collect some data to prove it. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing this, and you can do that as a retrospective review. There's a lot of cautionary tales. You've got to be very careful about this, because obviously proving this in a proper statistical manner is very difficult, and there are a lot of things that you can do that can be harmful. One thing it's really important to say when you're encouraging people, like I am, to try to collect data and do projects is that bad data in the public arena is worse than no data. The classic example being MMR, right? But there are loads of smaller projects done by trainees that meet that kind of thing. You just saying, I think that in my unit X treatment is associated with worse outcomes. You've seen the MMR scandal. That can be really harmful. So you have to do this properly and carefully, and do it with truth and have good data. Otherwise, you could actually do harm to your patients. You can audit the practice within your service against the gold standard. Audit with trainees, I don't know if this is true in the people in the room, has ended up with a really bad PR problem, that people think that this is something you're forced to do, you do for your portfolio, it's boring, it's trogging through notes and it's pointless and it doesn't ever make any meaningful change. And that's not right. I mean, it's really, if it's something that's come from you and you're interested in it and you think you can lead to meaningful change, then it is valuable. You know, you could say the new BSPD guideline has come in for diabetes. We're changing our fluid practice. We're completely changing the way we do it. Are we sticking to it? Do trainees do it? How easy it is to implement? And you could easily present that at a national meeting and come and get meaningful change and good outcomes from that. It's not just a box ticking exercise. It's not pointless. And it can be really valuable, but it's just picking your project and doing it in a good way and doing something that's meaningful to you and interesting. Don't just do the thyroid audit on the NICU or the the prolonged jaundice screen audit, because that's probably not meaningful to you, and you're not going to develop a passion for data for the rest of your career because you collected the thyroid audit on a NICU one day. And you could also just describe your service, the patient it treats, and the outcomes you achieve. I'll show you a paper that Libby and I wrote later in the talk, where we just described what patients we saw, the treatments we gave, and our outcomes in a really simple table form. Because if you're doing something slightly unusual, or you work in a tertiary service, that can actually be interesting in itself, and you don't need fancy statistics and audits and everything else. Okay, any questions so far? So we'll move on a little bit about what data could you get? What data can you collect? So obviously the basic is you can go for really granular data from patient records. You can go into patient records and take data out. And then more and more, and I would encourage trainees to get involved in this kind of thing, more and more we can take larger amounts of maybe less detailed or more structured, already clean data from national registries and databases. Maybe PicNet, I'm sure there's the neonatal equivalent, Badgernet, everybody's really familiar with ICNARC after COVID, with the ICNARC reports that were coming out in the UK. So you as trainees have a right to access this data. I've just put how to do it from PicNet in this slide, but there must be other ways in all kinds of specialties that you can do this. I would advise, if at all possible, as trainees doing projects, that you don't collect data by hand, if at all possible. Don't do this typing onto Excel yourself or by writing it on paper. It's time consuming. It's why audit's got a reputation for being boring. And also you'll interpret things with a variable slant and you'll make errors. We all make errors. You'll make mistakes in transcription. So if you can, try to take the data directly from Cerner, ICIP, EPR, whatever you're using. If you can do that, that is better quality. And it's easier. And then you can spend loads more time having fun with the data and analysing it than you would just sitting in an office collecting it all the time. Oh God. Okay, so what can you do when you've got the data? So you've taken a load of data out of ICIP or PicNet, or you've collected it yourself if that's the only thing that's open to you. What could you do? So you can simply firstly, there's no problem with just describing the populational group. I think as a group, or maybe as a whole profession, we've got this idea that stuff can't go in a journal, or it's not valuable, it can't go in a conference unless you've put p-values all over the paper and that they're less than 0.5. That isn't right anymore, and it's really going out of vogue. If you're just describing a population, patients with asthma are doing this. Today, 80% of patients with asthma are doing this, and yesterday, 60%. You don't always need to have statistics to do it. If your findings are interesting, you don't necessarily need to. However, if you want to say group 1 has more X than group 2, or last year we saw more peanut allergy than this year, you want to compare it, you can use simple statistics, a paired t-test or a Mann-Whitney U or a chi-squared to describe that usually more patients got X than Y. You can't describe outcomes with that, okay? You can't say more patients died after this treatment with that, because you can't do outcome data on a really simple statistics. But you can, it's fair enough to say in 1995 we saw X number of peanut allergies, in 2000 we saw Y, that is more, P equals whatever. As long as you're not trying to describe, you don't say that steroids lead to death in leukemia or something, that you couldn't do that. If you are trying to do associations, so having X is associated with Y, more children with peanut allergy were likely to drink coffee in the morning than children with tree pollen allergy or something, you're trying to do associations, then you might start thinking about multivariable regression analysis. Now, obviously, if you don't know how to do that, you're going to be asking for your seniors to help. But there are people knocking around who know how to do this with varying quality, and there are statistics and resources available to you. So it's not something you absolutely have to avoid. I'll show you a couple of projects that I did where we ended up using this, and I didn't do the stats myself for any of them. Okay, and what you're doing in those is you're adjusting for what we call confounding variables. So multivariable regression is what you'd use to test with an association between X and a particular outcome. And that's kind of appealing when you're designing a project as a trainee, especially if you've found something you're really passionate about, you've had this brilliant idea. I'm sure all kids that I've seen got X drug, did really badly. I want to test that, I want to find out. This is hard, you need big numbers and you're going to need a big amount of resilience and determination if you want to do this, but there's absolutely no reason not to. So you're going to take a huge amount of data and you're going to look at whether more kids that got drug X died or had complications than who didn't or got drug Y. That's what you're going to do. But we're going to have, in order to think about whether we could do that, we're going to have to learn what confounding is. So does anyone know? I'll open the chat back up. Feel free to write something in the chat. Does anyone know what confounding is? What do we mean when we say confounding? Silence. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example so we can see and we can kind of learn what it is. So I'm going to tell you that it's a fact. This is a fact. This is a medical fact, and I got this from a journal, that lung cancer is more common in people that drink coffee. Okay? Do you think that that's true? I'm going to tell you it's true. Do you think that means, I suppose, so that's what we've done. We've said drug X and is associated with drug Y, right? So do you think that that means that coffee causes lung cancer?
I think that, yeah. So you can't directly infer causality without thinking about confounders, because there may be other things about people who drink coffee that predispose them to lung cancer.
Right. Okay. So there actually are papers published that tell you that coffee causes lung cancer. Okay. From the 1980s, there are papers, but obviously they're bullshit, because the thing that's important is that it completely lacks biological plausibility. Okay. Yeah. The first thing to do with your project is to avoid coming up with this confounding. There has to be an explanation. You cannot just collect a load of data, dredge through it, find a p-value and say it's true, because you don't inhale coffee. It's not carcinogenic. It's highly unlikely that coffee is causing lung cancer, right? However, and this is the classic diagram to explain what confounding means. If you drink coffee, there's obviously something about people who like coffee. Far more people who drink a lot of coffee smoke. There's a strong association in population data between people that like to drink a lot of coffee and the people that like to smoke a lot of cigarettes. So that's the example of confounding. When you collect the data and you only collect data on coffee and lung cancer, it looks to you like coffee causes lung cancer because they're most common. But actually, smoking causes coffee and smoking causes lung cancer. So that's what we call confounding. And that's why you have to be super careful by saying that the MMR causes autism or whatever you're going to say. You have to be super careful, because actually you could have an unidentified other factor in the pathway that actually is the reason for the difference you've found. And there's no reason not to correct retrospective data. Okay, I'm not trying to put you off, and I think it's still valuable in PEDS, especially to do these projects and come up with these associations, because number one, how are you going to persuade people to do a trial if you don't come up with suggestions of hypotheses? And number two, realistically, we often don't get randomized controlled trials in PEDS because we're a poor man's specialty and things are rare, and we often don't get them. So we're trying to get the best evidence we can. So what I'm saying is you just have to go into your retrospective collection with your eyes open and try your best not to fall into this coffee lung cancer trap. Otherwise, you'll end up with this: the A to the Z list of things from the Daily Mail that can and can't cause cancer, including air pollution, alcohol, being young, being old. And obviously, that's what we're all trying to avoid doing, coming up with silly evidence that doesn't help but panics the general population away from making sensible health choices. And that's just the proper way of describing that picture that I just showed you about the coffee and the lung cancer. So we've got dependent variables and independent variables. And if you just measure the dependent and the independent variable on their own without looking at the confounders, it will look like there's a relationship between the two. But actually, it's confounding variables impacting both that's causing that relationship. And it may well be that they're not causing that relationship, they're just influencing it. And so if you adjust for them, the relationship might be larger or smaller than what you thought it was. Okay, tell me if this is getting a bit too nerdy and too much detail, but even confounding isn't really as simple as the picture I've just told you. And I'm going to give you the reference for this paper, because if you really are like me and this is what you're into and you really want to do loads of these projects, this is a really good place to start understanding how to look at retrospective data. Basically, this is the pathway I've just showed you, and we're calling this a backdoor path. So this is a different example, but it's the same thing. So getting more exercise reduces your risk of lung cancer. That's true. But people that do more exercise are much less likely to smoke. So you've got a big confounder there. So actually, if you close this backdoor path, you may have no relationship there. But there are backdoor paths in your project that you might not want to close. So this is what we call mediation. So there are other things. So getting less exercise actually does reduce your risk of lung cancer independently of smoking, because getting more exercise and reducing risk of lung cancer are both associated with immune function. Getting more exercise improves your immune function, and improved immune function reduces your risk of cancer. And so there is a relationship there, getting more exercise and lung cancer, even after adjusting for smoking. But if you adjusted for immune function there, you would reduce that. You would say there's no relationship, you'll get rid of it. But that would be wrong, wouldn't it? Because it's actually true, the relationship, because it's not a confounder, it's a mediator. So I'm not going to go into all of this. I'm not going to, because we're going to run out of time before I've shown you the projects and things. But there are other types of pathways that colliders essentially are just things that exist around as noise, but they're not confounders. So, for example, this one, doing shift work and obstructive sleep apnea are both lead to daytime sleepiness. If you do night shifts, you're sleeping in the day. If you've got but it's not a confounder, is it? Because it's not actually a false cause. They're just associated with both. So you don't need to adjust for that. They're just things around them. Same with having crackles in this one. This is an M bias diagram. Having crackles is in there, but it's not a confounder. The confounder is the smoking, isn't it? Any questions about that? Any questions about what confounding is?
Can you explain the M bias again, please?
Well, I think probably for this talk, it's a bit complicated, but I can get to explain what M bias is, I can send you all the paper. I don't want to get too bogged down for people that are kind of just thinking about what to do for a project. Okay, so the thing that's important, I guess, one of the things, I'll go into this a bit more in a second, it's really important that you adjust for known confounders, okay? And this is a place where lots of people get a bit confused. You don't put all of your data into a spreadsheet, see what the relationships are, and identify and adjust for everything else that comes with a p-value of less than 0.5. That would be wrong because of the diagram I've just shown, because you'll end up adjusting for mediators, and you'll end up adjusting for things that have a relationship but aren't confounders. You'll adjust for your colliders and your mediators. So what you have to do, if you want to do this type of project, you have to adjust for known confounders. And what I mean by known confounders is things that were known about in the literature before you started your talk. So I want to see whether more people that get clonidine on the intensive care unit die than those who don't. What makes you die on the intensive care unit? There's huge amounts of literature about that. Having a high PIM score, having a low oxygen, having a high lactate, having had a bone marrow transplant, having comorbidity. You adjust for those known things, and you have to find previous data. You can't adjust for things that your data shows. That's not good science. So we're not going to do that. That can be really difficult if you're a pediatrician in a really rare specialty, because you might not have very much data on what you're doing, and then you may have to, but generally. So obviously that creates a problem for us, that you can only adjust for confounding variables that you know about, and there might be other alternative explanations for the relationship you've found that you don't know about and so you haven't adjusted for. And so you just have to be open and honest. So if you're writing this up for a presentation at a conference, or you're trying to write a paper, you just have to be open and honest about that. I found this relationship. I've adjusted for everything I know about. However, of course, there could be another reason, and you actually should try and come up with the other reasons. Try and say it could be because people are more likely to give clonidine to children they think are going to die. It could be because of they're more likely to give clonidine to this condition. And, you adjust for the known confounders, but then you also say, well, obviously there could be other ones. And in all retrospective observational data that you do, you can never adjust for the fact that we as doctors are instinctive animals, and we work a lot on muscle memory, and really we tend to behave in a certain way when we have an instinct someone's going to die. And so you can never adjust for that feeling of doom. Objectively, the patient's got normal P score, they've got fine oxygenation, their lactate's okay, but you take one look at them and you think, bloody hell, call the priest. And you can't adjust for that in an analysis, clinician feeling. And that's probably one of the reasons why retrospective studies, for example, looking at corticosteroids in ICU, almost every retrospective analysis looking at giving steroids in ICU shows that steroids cause you to die. They may do, and that may be true, and we're just in denial, but it may also be true that people tend to never let anyone die without giving them a boost of methylpred, do they? People, that kid's dying, give them steroids. And so because there's that instinctive thing, even if you look at all the objective data, there's that instinctive thing, I think this kid's going to die, so I'm going to give them some steroids. And that may be an explanation for that. Okay. Tell me if we're getting a bit too deep in the statistical term. This is the last slide on your kind of confounding and how to analyze your data. Propensity matching is a little bit of a step further, where it's an idea that you're trying to adjust for what I've just described, the call the priest thing. So you're trying to adjust for clinician behavior to match patients in a way that for retrospective data, to try to almost pretend you're turning your retrospective data into RCT data. So you make a score, like people are more likely to have poor outcomes and give steroids if the child has X, Y, and Z but high PIM score, blah, 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 blah. And you try to put as many covariates as you can, age, gestation, comorbidity, all the things you might think about into that score. And that comes up with a propensity score, which is a score representing the probability that a subject will get the intervention, the steroid or the clonidine or the Optiflow or whatever you're trying to do this, or the CPAP, the probability that the clinicians in ED would give a baby CPAP based on their OBS when they come in, their heart rate, their OBS, their gas, their oxygenation. And then you try to match the patients into pairs, one who did and one who did not. So you're trying to find in your data 2 babies who appear to have presented to your ED with exactly the same heart rate, exactly the same lactate, exactly the same SATs, exactly the same GATs, and one of them someone put them on CPAP and one of them someone put them on Optiflow. And if you can get enough of those pairs out of your data, and then you're going to compare them, those 2 sets pair for pair, you should be able to compare outcomes, because you've got basically, you're basically saying you've almost got an RCT. You're pairing up people who did and didn't receive treatment. And if there's lots more people that got Optiflow than CPAP, you can even do it 2 to 1. So you can do 2 patients with Optiflow for every 1 who got CPAP, because we know that's about the ratio of what you would do. This is possible. It's a good thing to do. Obviously, it does have its major downsides, because everybody who hasn't got a friend gets knocked out. This is like a children's party game. So if you haven't got a friend, you're out. Because if there isn't anybody in the trial who had the same heart rate, age, gestation, OBS as you, you've got no pairs, you're out. So you probably reduce your cohort by about 10% of what you originally got. You know, it'll be at least off, but it may be right, it's down to 10. So you need a big sample. You need massive numbers to do a really well-powered propensity matching trial. So this is something that you would probably do if you're a trainee and you're going to think of doing a PICANET study. You're going to ask PICANET for all the bronchiolitis data for 10 years. This would be really good for that kind of thing. And this is what lots of the American registry database trials are based on, because you need your big numbers, and then you're going to try to match them. Any questions about that? Any of that? Okay. So having said all of that about what you can do, I just want to tell you what you definitely can't do. Some red rules for what you can't do with audits, service evaluation, and retrospective data. You can't prove causality, okay? Never ever submit a paper or an abstract or anything to a conference that says, I have therefore shown that putting children on Optiflow causes them to get better quickly. You haven't. You've shown an association, which may all be due to confounding and clinician choice. So never say that, because if you say that, then you're going to get panned and no one will accept your work. And really, you have to be extremely cautious, and probably again never suggest that because you've shown an association with being on Optiflow and going home 2 days earlier from your department, you should never say, therefore I think everyone should get Optiflow. Don't say that, because you haven't shown causality, so you shouldn't be recommending people change their clinical practice. Usually what your conclusion is therefore we need a trial. Therefore, don't change your practice because we need to get more data. Okay. Also, you can't suggest, this is slightly off what I'm talking about, I'm not going to bore you with all the stats of this one, but you also can't suggest that you know how to predict poor or good outcomes. So don't say, therefore, having clonidine or having a lactate of above 5 on the admission to the ID is predictive of death. You haven't done that. You need to do that with prospective data and then validate the score and revalidate the scoring system. You've just shown an association. It's still valuable and you can still get that published, but don't say you've developed the ability to predict, because that's not possible. The other thing you must not do is someone says to you, I've got this massive spreadsheet of everyone that's come into ICU and all of their blood gases and all of their chlorides and all of their diagnosis, and you run a million statistical tests and find a P of 0.05 and then try to write an abstract around that. That's the absolute opposite of what you could do, because obviously 1 in 20 times you do a stats test, it's significant. And doing a data dredge without a clear question and collecting the data because of your question just creates bad data. So in all research that's good quality, that all retrospective projects, even audit, before you collect any data and before you've seen any data, you need to write all your questions, your method, and what you're going to do. Looking at the data and then writing your method is cheating. So you've got to decide what you're going to do with the data, what tests you would do, what's your question, what your confounders are in the previous literature you're going to adjust you a priori, you would say in the method, before you collect the data. Otherwise you're cheating, and you might do a Andrew Wakefield and tell everyone not to have an immunisation that will save their lives. And also the other thing you must not do is, this is kind of on the same thing, is don't prove something that's not possible to explain. So don't try and prove that coffee causes lung cancer, because there isn't what we call biological plausibility, which you're going to need to have to present it to people. So if you think, for example, having clonidine is associated with an increased risk of death on the ICU, you need to have a biological, you need to look in the literature down to your kind of animal research, your biochemical research, and have a reason that that could possibly be true. Because if there's absolutely no human reason you can think of why it would be true, it's probably just it's probably not true, is it? It's just an anomaly. So you need to think about how you're going to explain to people that Optiflow is better than CPAP, because that's the question you might be asked. However, I'm just trying again and again not to put you off, basically. If you have noticed something that people are doing more and more, like bloody Optiflow, Magsulfin, there's all these things, and you don't think it's got benefit, or you think it's harm, or you think you've seen someone do it as better than someone else, then your work could be important. And showing an association might be important to persuade the people with the big bucks that actually a trial's needed here, and it's not just okay that we're doing X, Y, and Z without any evidence. And also showing variation is really important, because if at the Whittington, every child in status gets phenytoin, and if at 2 miles down the road at Barnet, every child in status gets Keppra, well, that's not right, is it? Because that means those children are de facto being entered into a randomized controlled trial without any of the benefits of being in a randomized controlled trial, because their data's not being collected and they're not getting the benefits of being in a trial. So actually, if you've noticed that all your DGHs that you go to are doing something completely different, well, that's wrong, isn't it? That's really wrong. So actually, you should, proving that one centre is doing this and one centre do it is a valid thing to do, and that's important, because that's the background for a randomised controlled trial, and that's the way you get ethical approval to do a randomised controlled trial, isn't it? Because what you're saying is actually, people could get treatment X, Y, or Z at the moment already. This randomisation has already happened. My trial isn't introduce a new drug, it's to try to find out, of the 3 ways that all the clinicians are already doing it, which one's best. And that's like the concept and Eclipse, that's where that came from, isn't it? Everybody's, half people are giving Keppra, half people are giving phenytoin. We actually need to know which of those are better. We know it's an important thing to know when you're talking about research, that we do know that children who are entered into randomized controlled trials at admission to hospital have better outcomes than children who aren't, as a general population-based observation. It actually, being in research trials improves your care, because your care is more protocolized, there's more attention to detail, you're more likely to get careful treatment and extra money, because remember, research trials come with money, extra money goes into your treatment as well. So just being in a research trial, even if you get the saline, the placebo, you'll have an improved outcome than if you said no. And that's an important thing to be able to tell parents and to be able to say in your start and job interviews and things. Okay. Again, I've kind of said this again and again, really trying to persuade you how important this is. You can't do your randomized controlled trial unless you know what people are doing out there in the wild west of what we call usual care, because you need to know what your control arm are going to get. You need to know what other therapies they're going to get. And you need to know how many children, if you're going to do Concept or Eclipse, looking at Keppra and phenytoin, you need to know how many children at the Whittington got it, how many children at Barnet got it, because you're going to need to do your power calculations. And so you need to know how many centres over how many years do I need to include in this study to get it. This is what funders are going to want to know. In 10 years' time, the reason why I want you to do these projects now is because maybe you don't think you're an academic and you don't think this is for you, but maybe it is. And in 10 years' time, if you want to be applying to funders for money, you're going to need to have done the basic stuff at this level now. You need to be able to, describe variation. If everyone's doing something differently, you need a trial. And you need to also be looking for equipoise. You need to be able to know what your colleagues think. So doing surveys, which I haven't touched on much today, you need to ask people what they think. Some trials are definitely not possible, like trials like FEAST in the UK. We would never have been able to do FEAST in the UK because paediatricians all think that fluid boluses save lives. So there's no point in trying to do a trial of FEAST in the UK because nobody would agree to not give fluid boluses. You couldn't do it. So you're going to have to ask your colleagues whether they would do it. And you need to collect retrospective data. What percentage of children with septic shock coming through UK EDs get boluses? Well, it's 100%, isn't it? Or almost 100%. There's no point trying to do a trial of not giving them a bolus because really, if you've got that much going on, it won't work. So would people randomise? And that's what we tend to call equipoise. Is there equipoise in the system? And if the Keppra phenytoin thing is like it is, if half the hospitals are giving one and half the other, then you can say there's equipoise, and that's something that would work. So we've talked a little bit as we've been going through about how it's best to get your work published, and a few more tips I've got when you're starting to think of an idea, to make sure that you might be something that could get an abstract or presented at a conference. Read what's published before you start. So make sure you're not doing a project that's been in a journal a year ago and just completely repeating someone else's project. If you're thinking of the Lancet or even PCCM or the BMJ, if you're thinking of archives, if you're aiming really high, you need to be thinking of multi-centre or get very large numbers, because small single-centre audits don't make it into big journals anymore. There is absolutely nothing wrong with publishing in a smaller journal, and it's the same number of points on your application. So you don't need to do multi-centre just for that, but don't get yourself at thinking that, because I don't want you to be disappointed at the end, because that will then put you off doing things in the future. If you can, and you've done a project, try to present it at a conference first, a good conference, probably not the Royal College of Paediatrics. So it's not meant to be derogatory, but you just tend to get very easy, nice audiences there. Try to publish at a specialist scientific conference, because the people in the audience might ask you some really tough questions. Those tough questions are going to be what the peer reviewers want to know about your manuscript, and you'll change your manuscript based on those questions. So try to benefit from conferences first. Many large journals, if you're going to try to get this in the Lancet, you're going to need IRAS, because how could you get a paper that's not generalizable to the general population in a big journal? So if you're really ambitious and you want to get into PCCM, do IRAS, because they're not going to accept it anymore if it's not generalizable anyway. And always present your work. And actually, in fact, I should go back to this. Get this checklist out before you start your project. Do a strobe checklist. If it's a retrospective, there's a Cherries checklist for surveys. There are other different checklists for different studies. So the classic would be a consort for a randomized controlled trial, right? Well, you're not going to do a randomized controlled trial, I don't think. The strobe is the equivalent for what you might do, and Cherries is the equivalent for a survey. Have a look at it. Have you adjusted for bias? Have you adjusted for confounders? It's a list of things that you have to do, and send a strobe checklist with a page number in your abstract into the journal with it, because then it really shows, oh, this person really knows how to produce a good quality study. They've got a strobe checklist and they've sent their strobe checklist in with their study, and that's really good for peer review. And you have to keep the data nowadays, okay? In modern, you'll see this from a load of the stuff that happened with COVID. You need to be able to produce what you've said. You say X and Y and all these numbers. In 5 years' time, if someone comes across your paper and says, I think that's absolute bullshit, I think there's a mistake in this, you need to be able to go back with your raw data, so you have to keep it somewhere. And that's really difficult as a trainee, because you're going to move around, so you're not going to have access to the computer system in the place where you got it. So maybe consider a repository or something like that, or giving the data to a consultant who can hold it in the trust in which it was kept, so that if somebody claims you've committed fraud in 5 years' time, you can go back to your original data and provide evidence that you didn't.
Got about 5 minutes over this. Becky, just so you know. Sorry,
we're running a bit far behind. I'm sorry. No. I'll get as far as I can. I'm going to skip this then. This is the paper that all of this has come from. Okay, so anyone can have the slide, and it's been recorded. So have a read of that if you want more detail. Okay, so for the last 6 minutes, please put questions in the chat as well, so I can try and answer them as we scoop through. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I did to give you an idea of what you can do as a trainee. So I started I did a couple of things beforehand, but mainly started being interested in data at SD6. I was doing PICU, not as a PICU grid trainee, as a general PEDS trainee. And you do, as you know, as part-time, because I had 3 kids and I was rotating around a lot of centres. And I noticed that bronchiolitis, which is the most common reason for being in PICU, and it's almost everyone in PICU, like 80% of patients, is managed totally and utterly differently, depending on which centre that you go to. So if you go to St Mary's or Gosh, you'll get one X, Y, and Z management. If you go to the Evelina, every single thing about your management, your fluid prescription, your antibiotics, whether you get steroids, your sedation, whether you put intratracheal tube is different. And that just seemed totally mad to me, that you can be a child who gets ill in December and you go to one place and get one management, and then in January you get the same illness with a different virus and you get completely different management. And it seemed to me that people had different outcomes, like that children were on a ventilator a lot longer at one place than they might have been the other. And so what I did was contacted a couple of pals, like someone I was friends with from my training who was at Gosh at that time, and I was here, and a friend that I had that was at the Evelina doing PICU at that time. And the 3 of us got together and collected data. We mostly did it manually. We tried to get it from ICIT, but believe it or not, in those days, this is only 2015, that Evelina was still writing paper notes for everything. So we had to do some data dredging, but we each decided we'd collect 150 patients from a certain time period and collect, like I described, it's really easy to look up the confounders of bronchiolitis. We know that we all know, don't we? It's the preemies, it's congenital heart disease, it's people who have cardiovascular instability at the start, people who are needing a lot of oxygen, it's younger babies do worse, RSV does worse. It's all out there in the literature. It's really easy to find what makes you worse when you've got bronchiolitis. So we knew we had a really good clear set of confounders that we could collect, and then we collected all the management variables, and then we collected the outcomes. And this is our paper. So we collected, as I say, a couple of hundred patients, or like 169 from 2 centres and 124 from the other, because it was a 5-year period and one centre was less busy than the other 2. And we took loads of management variables, but obviously this is the trendy Twitter thing that they make into the paper. Obviously they can't fit everything that we collected on, and these are the ones we focused on. So different place of tube, different sedation, whether you're on clonidine or not, and a completely different fluid strategy, 60 mils per kilo positive at one centre and 18 at the other on average after a day on PICU. So we adjusted for all of those things that, and that's enough. That could be the paper, okay? You don't need the stats, because isn't that, I think that's crazy, right? Like that if you get a condition, you'll manage that differently depending on where you go. So in a way, that's the paper, and you don't, and because I can't tell you which one of those is better from this paper, and that's what I've been trying to get across, I guess. So I can't tell you which of those hospitals is doing a better job or which of those management strategies is better, but the fact that there's that much variation suggests that maybe a trial is needed for some of this, because this is such a common condition, and it's so important for the NHS's management, isn't it? Because it takes up all the ICU and paediatric beds for the whole winter. After adjusting we did, because it's irresistible, isn't it, to look for outcomes. Whenever you do this and you say you're not going to look for outcomes, you can't resist just seeing who got the best outcomes, because we all like to know who won, don't we? And Centre A's mean duration of ventilation was 44% longer than Centre C, and that's about 2 days longer. Which, imagine if this is true NHS wide, imagine the impact that could have on us over the winter with PICU beds. So that's my kind of first trainee led project, and you can see it's doable. This is not that difficult. I had a friend at Great Ormond Street, a friend here. We did 160 patients each. It's not mad. It took a very long time from start to finish. The one caution we tell is this stuff always takes way longer than you think it's going to take. But if you've got patience and you've got the data and you're prepared to do it over a few years, that's actually totally fine. And you can see I managed to get this published in Pediatric Critical Care Medicine. They chose it as their editor's feature article. I've talked about it ad infinitum. I was invited to speak at the SCCM in America this year. I've talked about it at loads of different places. So I really feel that this was just a basic audit. So this was registered as a service valuation. We didn't do IRAS, but this was 5 years ago. We could get away with that stuff. And I really feel that it has made a meaningful difference. People are thinking about this more. I don't think that it can change practice, and I've told you not to say that, but it's making people thoughtful about the fact that there's these big differences, and maybe we should think about a trial, and maybe we need to think about this a bit more. That's one, and I'll just show a few other things. This is just to give you an example of the kind of things you could do as a single trainee, rotating every 6 months during training. And a different time in PICU, I did this. So this is more of a granular. So this one I collected, we got the patients from PicNet, did a PicNet download, and then took data out of ISIP to match it with those patients, and did it. This one was a real down to the grindstone, taking hourly data out of it, still taken out of ISIP, and about half of this project was done just with computers and no hand collecting. But we took oxygen saturation, oxygen sats and FiO2 in patients with ARDS hourly out of the database, and showed over days when you gave steroids what happened to their OSI. Is there a pattern that when you give steroids to children with ARDS, remember this is before Dexarards, this is before recovery, before everyone else started going about steroids. I'm like a trendsetter. We wanted to see what happens to people's saturations when you give them steroids for PARDS on ICU. So that's a more granular one, and that was one that I did during a 6-month placement. So that's because it was more granular, smaller patient numbers. That was a shorter project. In PICU, this was another quick one. This is one of the ones, like I showed you, X is associated with Y bad outcomes. So this was one where we took a load of data out of ISIP, and this was just in one go. I never collected any data by hand from this. We took 2,000 patients' data from PicNet, and then we actually paid a guy from ISA, from Philips, our IT system, to take data out and match it, and then we came up with this, and we did a multivariable regression analysis looking at chloride and associations with bad outcomes. That was one. And then this is just to show you that a service evaluation can get published just as a service evaluation. So this was published this year. Libby was the first author on this. And really in this one, this was us as a pediatric intensive care unit looking after adults with COVID. This is a rare and unusual thing, and it's not done very often. So this is really just a service evaluation. How many patients did we look after? How many of them died? How many of them had trachees? And then we described what happened on the adult ICU, but not p-values, not, describing lots of stats. Just these are the adults that went to adult ICU. These are the ones that went to PICU. What was the difference? How did we manage it differently? And what was their experience and how did it differ? And so that's just to show you that a basic service evaluation, 50 patients, can also make its way into a journal and be valuable and interesting to other people. Okay, Libby, do you want me to stop there?
I think let's pause and see if anyone has any questions, and then we can kind of officially close, but I don't see any reason why if you want to say more, or people want to say, we could also do that, but it just allows people to sign off if they have to go back to clinical work sadly. Does anyone have any questions who are in attendance or want to post anything in the chat? I think now would be a good time, and then we can continue for a few more minutes if people want to stay. If not, I take everyone's silence as please talk more. But please also feel free to head off if you have to go. I did post the link to the feedback just in that first bit of the chat. Please do leave feedback if you can, it'd be really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so just finally, I just wanted to go a tiny bit further and describe to you how doing all these little bits and bobs eventually can lead on a research journey later in your career to doing a randomized controlled trial. So this is Ram. You might have seen him before. He's one of our consultants here, and he's just become a kind of academic consultant with half of his job being at Imperial. And his bugbear, my bugbear, is differences in management of bronchiolitis between different units. His bugbear was, what the bloody hell is this Optiflow thing? And why is everyone getting Optiflow anymore? And why did we put CPAP in the bin? And what without any evidence whatsoever, we've brought this thing in, and nobody in the UK ever bothered to collect any pediatric evidence for the use of Optiflow, and we all binned CPAP. And was that the right thing to do? And so this is just to show you where you go with that. So he started off, he did a survey. What are you all doing? What percentage of pediatricians are now moved over to Optiflow and not using CPAP anymore? A bit more survey, why do you do that? Who's doing it? Would you randomize people, and do you have CPAP still available in your unit? Where is CPAP still available? Where is Optiflow? National survey, all hospitals now. What percentage have a HDU? A bit more logistical stuff. Where are you using CPAP? What percentage have this available? Getting a bit more detail. But these are all survey related studies, and that is easily doable. These are all things that the first author on all of these will have been paediatric trainees doing a 6-month placement. Okay, so these are all well doable within your 6 or 12 months. I don't want to say this because it sounds like it's so unfair on the full-time people, but especially if you're part-time, you do 12 months. This is the best thing about being a part-time trainee. There are lots of downsides, but being part-time means you really get time to do this stuff. I know you've got a lot else going on in your life, I don't mean that. And then you describe, you've done your survey, this is the part where you find out what people say they do, which we all know what people say they do is not what they actually do. So you find out what people say they do, and then you have to find out what they do. So a big registry study, good place to start. Take the data from PickerNet, that's available for most people. It's available to you if you come up with a good idea. Take the data from PickerNet and find out how many people are using high flow, how many people are using CPAP after extubation on PICU, what the numbers are, and what features are associated with those things. And also then, what percentage failed, what percentage got reintubated, for example. And will there be equipoise? You know, are people so obsessed now with using Optiflow that there won't be any point trying to do a trial of CPAP versus Optiflow? And then this is another audit, again, done by a trainee during a 6-month placement, a bit more of a granular thing now, and a few DGHs, a bit more like what I did in the bronchiolitis, detailed analysis of a few DGHs, how many people they put on high flow, how many people they put on CPAP, what happened to them and what their reasons for their choices were. And then an association with outcomes one, you know, what were the outcomes for people who got non-invasive ventilation before they were intubated compared to didn't? And you know, did more people die with one than the other? And then all of that, you've got all of that background data, and you've proved to people we need a trial. There's loads of variation, there's still equipoise, there's an association with worse outcomes if you do X, then we need a trial. And then you can get funding for a small pilot study, because the next stage isn't to do the trial. Obviously, you've got to prove it would work. Then you do a pilot study to find out whether it was. You do 30 patients in each group, or here they did 250 patients or whatever. Find out whether it works, find out whether people can be recruited, find out whether parents agree to consent, find out whether, you know, whether it was really dangerous, find out whether how quickly you could recruit people and whether it was going to be cost effective to do the trial. And then you get the real trial. And that's kind of the process of moving forward from your original audit that you just think of when you're a trainee as a small idea to a massive multi-center randomized control trial, which RAM has just finished, and First ABC has just finished recruiting 600 patients in each arm, which is a humongous achievement and leads to opens loads and loads of doors. And he is a very academic, clever person, but I don't think you necessarily have to be, especially not at the start. You don't have to have a PhD to be starting off with those national surveys and audits and retrospective studies. And this is the minimum requirements for an RCT. So these are the things you need to have done before you can start a randomized control trial. So an SR is a systematic review. That's probably beyond the scope of you guys doing it in a training post, because it takes much more than 6 months and it requires lots of brains and time. But you need to do an SR, a survey of practice, some observational data, and then a pilot study, and then you get to do your trial. So this is the last slide now. I'm really sorry I ran over a bit. We started a couple minutes late as well, sorry. So just to summarize, how can you get involved in collecting retrospective data to make your service better, treat your patients better, improve your knowledge, and hopefully get stuff published? Come up with an idea that's your own and that you feel passionate about and interested in, because it takes resilience and perseverance to get these things done. If you're not interested in it, you're not going to finish it. Don't try to cure cancer. A simple idea is better. Something that's going to be easy and simple is great, and it's probably going to be more important to most people. And you'll find it's amazing what you don't know, what we don't know about hospitals, what they're doing down the road, and what common practice is. What you think might be common practice may well not be. And like I showed you in the previous slides, team up with some friends, get a group of trainees who are interested in doing something like this together, because a service evaluation project looking at 4 hospitals is way more powerful than 1. And you're all moving around a lot. And so you can get more data and more interesting projects if you collect, and bigger numbers if you collect from 4 hospitals than 1. Just be careful about like what I was saying about getting your IRAS and registering it if you're doing it at lots of places. As I already said, lots of the bigger journals won't accept things that are done at single centres anymore. So you're going to make your study more powerful if you do it at lots of places, and create networks, establish relationships with other people who are interested in the same things as you, get to know consultants who might have the keys to data and be interested, and keep going with them. The people, as you may have seen when I showed you the 4 papers I published as a trainee, the authors on them are all the same people, because once you've found someone at a different hospital that's interested in this, you say, hey, how about we collect data on steroids now? Hey, how about we think about this? And that'll give you much more effective projects. And get to know your IT geeks in wherever you're working. You know, who can take data out of Cerner? Who can take data from ISA? There are probably in every DGH you work with, there probably is somebody who could do this, but it's about finding out who might be able to help, who knows about this stuff that could make it easier, because you really don't want to be going back to paper notes and collecting from paper. It's so boring. Okay, and that is everything. I'm so sorry it went over. So this is what I'm going to leave you with.